the Director of Education for Camp Fateh, now called Camp Fit Versa, and currently serves on the Board of Directors with the Sikh Coalition. He does spend much of his time facilitating workshops on Gurmat history and activism at various summer camps, workshops, gurdwaras, and universities throughout the Washington, D.C. metro area. We are very lucky to have him here this weekend with his family. By training, he's a technologist, and he currently works as a consultant in the nonprofit technology sector. He is also pursuing his MBA at the Johns Hopkins Carey School of Business. And he is going to talk to us a little bit today about that neglected period of history in the decade after the 1984 attacks and massacre. I think some of you will find some of this information quite new and maybe a little alarming at times, but definitely a part of our history that is not as well understood as maybe it should be.
ਹੁਣ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਜਸਵੰਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਜੀ ਖਾਲੜਾ ਆਪਣੇ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਸੰਗਤਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਂਝੇ ਕਰਨਗੇ। ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ।
ਸਤਿਗੁਰਾਂ ਦੇ ਚਰਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਨਿੱਘ ਮਾਣਦੇ ਗੁਰੂ ਦੇ ਪਿਆਰਿਓ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ, ਸ੍ਰੀ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ। ਇੱਕ ਲਘੂ ਕਥਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜਦ ਸੂਰਜ ਪਹਿਲੀ ਵਾਰ ਅਸਤਨ ਲੱਗਾ ਸੀ ਤਾਂ ਜਿਉਂ-ਜਿਉਂ ਉਹ ਆਪਣਾ ਪੰਧ ਮੁਕਾ ਰਿਹਾ ਸੀ, ਚਾਨਣ ਘਟ ਰਿਹਾ ਸੀ। ਚਾਨਣ ਘਟ ਰਿਹਾ ਸੀ, ਹਨੇਰੇ ਦੀ ਆਮਦ ਦੇ ਨਿਸ਼ਾਨ ਪ੍ਰਗਟ ਹੋ ਰਹੇ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਲੋਕਾਂ 'ਚ ਹਾਹਾਕਾਰ ਮਚ ਰਹੀ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਸੂਰਜ ਛਿਪ ਜਾਊਗਾ, ਹਨੇਰਾ ਪਸਰ ਜਾਊਗਾ, ਕਿਸੇ ਨੂੰ ਕੁਛ ਦਿਸੂ ਨਾ ਤੇ ਸਾਡਾ ਕੀ ਬਣੂਗਾ। ਦੁਨੀਆ ਫਿਕਰਮੰਦ ਸੀ, ਪਰ ਸੂਰਜ ਅਸਤਿਆ। ਹਨੇਰੇ ਨੇ ਆਪਣਾ ਜ਼ੋਰ ਵਿਖਾਉਣ ਲਈ ਧਰਤੀ ਤੇ ਪੈਰ ਪਾਇਆ, ਪਰ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਦੂਰ ਕਿਸੇ ਝੌਂਪੜੀ 'ਚੋਂ ਇੱਕ ਦੀਪਕ ਨੇ ਸਿਰ ਚੁੱਕਿਆ। ਉਸ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਮੈਂ ਹਨੇਰੇ ਨੂੰ ਚੈਲੰਜ ਕਰਦਾ, ਹੋਰ ਕੁਛ ਨਹੀਂ ਤੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਆਲੇ ਦੁਆਲੇ ਤਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਨਹੀਂ ਲਾਗੇ ਲੱਗਣ ਦਿਆਂਗਾ, ਆਪਣੇ ਆਲੇ ਦੁਆਲੇ ਤਾਂ ਚਾਨਣ ਕਾਇਮ ਕਰਾਂਗਾ। ਤਾਂ ਉਸ ਦੀਪਕ ਨੂੰ ਦੇਖ ਕੇ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਹਰ ਝੁੱਗੀ ਝੌਂਪੜੀ 'ਚ ਇੱਕ ਦੀਪਕ ਉੱਠਿਆ ਤੇ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਹੈਰਾਨ ਰਹਿ ਗਈ ਕਿ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀਪਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਹਨੇਰੇ ਨੂੰ ਪਸਰਨੋਂ ਰੋਕਿਆ ਤੇ ਲੋਕ ਦੇਖ ਸਕੇ। ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਸਮਝਦਾ ਕਿ ਅੱਜ ਜਦੋਂ ਇੱਕ ਹਨੇਰਾ ਪੂਰੇ ਜ਼ੋਰ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਸੱਚ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਫਤਿਹ ਪਾਉਣ ਲਈ ਲਲਕਾਰ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ, ਤਾਂ ਹੋਰ ਕੁਛ ਨਹੀਂ ਤਾਂ ਮੈਂ ਕਹੂੰਗਾ ਅਣਖੀਲਾ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਇੱਕ ਦੀਪਕ ਦੀ ਨਿਆਈ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਚੈਲੰਜ ਕਰ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ। ਤੇ ਅਰਦਾਸ ਕਰਦਾ ਕਿ ਸਤਿਗੁਰੂ ਇਸ ਜੋਤ ਨੂੰ ਜਗਦੀ ਰੱਖੇ।
First, I want to thank all the organizers for giving me this opportunity to present to you today. I also don't want to go unnoticed or to take for granted that we have this opportunity this weekend to speak about 1984. For someone who's been speaking on this topic for many years, there are plenty of places, gurdwaras, institutions, Sikh institutions, that don't want this topic spoken about. They would much prefer to sweep it under the rug. And so I think that's a testament to the leadership here, to the leadership of Star Pradeep Singh Uncle Ji and Auntie Ji for as far back as I can remember, not letting this period of history go by. So thanks to them. what we're going to talk about today, you know, I feel like I've done these presentations on 84 for so many years, to the point now where, you know, especially in these 5-year intervals, we talk about 1984, we talk about often the events that led up to 1984, but rarely do we talk about what happened afterwards. And for me, you know, it became a personal interest. I wanted to dive into it a little bit more, learn what happened after 84. Did everything just go quiet and here we are right now? Was it just, you know, do we just fast forward to the Gurmat Singh and Rajwana incidents? What happened in between that time? And I learned of many significant events that happened. In fact, there's an organization in the South that has focused most of their effort on exposing the atrocities that happened during that time. So I asked for permission for this workshop from Singh that this may not focus as much about 1984. This is about 1985. This is about the decade that followed the events of 1984. And one of the major personalities that we're going to talk about in the context of this discussion is just once in Colorado, which you just heard, the powerful introduction to his speech that he did in April 1995 in Canada. So, jumping right in, for us to really get a true appreciation and understanding of what took place in that decade of 1985 to 1995, we need to understand some basic context. I'm not going to go too much into this because I think we've already spent, you know, some time going through some of the details. The militancy movement began after the Warsaw attack in '84. Eyewitnesses estimated roughly 4,000 to 8,000 people killed. The numbers vary, but this is one I took. After the assassination of Indira Gandhi, senior politicians, police officers orchestrated pogroms through the streets of Delhi. Roughly estimated 3,000 people killed, Sikh homes burned, businesses burned, and so on and so forth. As a result of these two top bullet points that you see here, Sikhs came together and said, there's no justice for us, we're going to liberate our own sovereign Sikh homeland. Militancy movement increased, decade from 1984 to 1994, escalation of militancy in Punjab, and was then counteracted by the Punjab police. Now, it is lawful for a state to react to an insurgency movement or an uprising by militants. But the methods in which the government used, the methods in which the Punjab police used were so far-reaching, were so inhumane, that they violated human rights norms that pretty much exist internationally throughout every country. And what do I mean by human rights violations? Let's talk a little bit about it. So this is, you guys are going to tell me what this is. This is Human Rights 101. Extrajudicial killings. Big word, but something, you know, we should all know about. Who can tell me what an extrajudicial killing is?
The cops or the people at the scene decide he's wrong, he's right, just shoot them up, and they decide the sentence, carry out the execution themselves.
It's a little bit less formal than that. You're on the right track. A little bit less formal. Who can tell me who there's?
I believe it's a death without due process.
Yes. So to the point, to give you an example, and something that was rampant during Punjab at this time is police rounds up suspects. No sort of innocence, guilt at this point. Rounds up suspects. They're interrogated, tortured, perhaps, and they can be killed within their detainment right there. They can be killed during interrogation. Killed during that torture process or interrogation, and there's no report filed. There's no due process, as you're saying. There's no even record of it, to the point where parents are coming to look to see where their son has gone or where their daughter has gone, and this person has been killed, and there is no record. They then become what's known as disappeared. Fake encounters, who can tell me what that is?
People who are troublesome to the cops or the organization, the government, they can be put as terrorists and they're running out of the community. Just shoot them and said that they were escaping interrogation or an arrest or anything, and that's why they were shot for.
Sure. So even within the context of the interrogation, they could say, well, hey, there was a firefight. They were caught in crossfire. So the actual event, there was no actual crossfire. There was no actual one-on-one fighting. And you'll see this if you look. I remember as a kid looking at the pictures of week after week of the shaheeds who were being reported as killed. We would later find out that they were killed during interrogation or torture. But the pictures that you'll see of them are them lying in a field somewhere. They were killed while lying in the field as though that they were killed during crossfire or some type of shooting. So they staged essentially these fake encounters. So extrajudicial killings and fake encounters became the norm of the Punjab police. Whereas human rights organizations were not very much involved in investigating the events of June '84, in 1985 and 1995, human rights groups were very much involved. In fact, Human Rights Watch, a very reputable human rights organization, described the counterinsurgency tactics by the Punjab police as the most extreme example. This is an organization that looks at human rights violations across the world and said the most extreme example of a policy where the end appeared to justify any and all means, including torture and murder. Police were allowed to torture and murder with complete impunity, no repercussions. So you might ask yourself, how could the Punjab police do this? What did the government do? Shouldn't the government stop them? Well, in fact, the government was the one who created the laws that allowed this to happen. So, how many of you have ever heard of the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Act, the TADA Act? Yeah, almost half, right? So the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Act, commonly known as TADA, was passed in 1985. It authorized the detention of persons based on mere suspicion. If it was just under mere suspicion that you might have been implicated in a crime, you could be rounded up. Detainees are presumed guilty until proven innocent. And you're provided granting of bail for, and cannot be charged for up to 90 days. So you can go 90 days of being in prison, not indicted for anything, tortured, interrogated in jail, without, just on mere suspicion. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act of 1983 pretty much gave shoot-to-kill policy, arrest people without warrants, shoot-to-kill suspected terrorists, and complete prosecutorial immunity. So again, police officers can shoot to kill mere suspects with complete immunity, no repercussions to their actions. Amnesty International, when they investigated these counterinsurgency policies, Amnesty International said that the security forces had complete powers to torture and kill. So I can go on and sort of these were national laws, well, except no, Armed Forces was Punjab and Chandigarh. Terrorist and Disruptors was national, but it could be applied and not applied in certain cases. In fact, in 1995, they finally repealed TADA, but even afterwards applied it in certain cases. So, take a pick. So I'm going to try throughout this workshop. I know I struggled to find how to make this interactive, and I couldn't really think of any good activities. Tomorrow will be a little more interactive. But I did want to intersperse this seminar with a little bit of video, because I can sit here and talk about this all day, but I would rather you hear it from people who experienced it firsthand, from some of the interviews of the people. So I want to give you an idea of what the impact was on the life of actual Punjabis. So we're going to hear from a few people whose own children were picked up under these laws. So this first one, and these are just 2 3-minute clips, it's from Gurmat Singh.
ਮੁੱਖ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਇਹ ਹੈ ਕਿ 22 ਜੁਲਾਈ 89 ਨੂੰ ਹਾਊਸ ਨੰਬਰ 1752 ਫੇਜ਼ 5 ਤੋਂ ਮੇਰੇ ਕੋਲ ਸਕੂਲ, ਮੈਂ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਸੀਨੀਅਰ ਸੈਕੰਡਰੀ ਸਕੂਲ ਖਰੜ ਐਜ਼ ਪ੍ਰਿੰਸੀਪਲ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਦਾ ਸੀ। 1:30 ਵਜੇ ਫੋਨ ਆਇਆ ਕਿ ਇੱਥੇ ਪਹੁੰਚੋ, ਸਵੇਰ ਦਾ 9 ਵਜੇ ਦਾ ਘੇਰਾ ਪਿਆ ਕੋਠੀ ਨੰਬਰ 1752 ਫੇਜ਼ 5 ਮੋਹਾਲੀ। ਬਈ ਆਓ, ਸਾਡੀ ਕਮੇਟੀ ਬਣੀ ਹੋਈ ਸੀ ਪੁਲਿਸ ਵਧੀਕੀਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿਰੁੱਧ। ਜਸਟਿਸ ਅਜੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਬੈਂਸ ਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਰਿਪੋਰਟ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀ, ਤਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਬੰਦੇ ਇਕੱਠੇ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਪਹੁੰਚੇ। ਲਗਭਗ 3 ਵਜੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਕੋਠੀ ਕੋਲ ਪਹੁੰਚੇ ਹੀ ਸੀ। ਕੁਲਵਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਕਿੱਡ, ਇੱਕ ਮੁੰਡਾ ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਹੋਰ, ਹਾਊਸ ਨੰਬਰ 1752 ਵਿੱਚ ਐਂਟਰ ਹੋ ਰਹੇ। ਅੰਦਰ ਪੁਲਿਸ ਲੁਕੀ ਬੈਠੀ ਸੀ। 8-9 ਬੰਦਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਕੁਲਵਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਕਿੱਡ ਨੂੰ ਉੱਥੇ ਹੀ ਢਾ ਲਿਆ, ਹੱਥ ਪੈਰ ਬੰਨ੍ਹ ਕੇ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਕੰਬਲ ਪੰਡ ਬੰਨ੍ਹ ਕੇ ਜੀਪ 'ਚ ਸੁੱਟ ਕੇ ਲੈ ਗਏ। ਉੱਪਰ ਬੈਠੇ ਸੀ ਛੱਤ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਗੋਲੀ ਚਲਾਈ, ਦੂਜੇ ਮੁੰਡੇ 'ਤੇ ਗੋਲੀ ਵੱਜੀ, ਉਹਦੀ ਔਨ ਦਾ ਸਪੌਟ ਮੌਤ ਹੋ ਗਈ। ਤਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਫਿਰ ਉੱਥੋਂ ਥਾਣੇ ਆਏ, ਬੜਾ ਇਕੱਠ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ, ਨਾਅਰਾਬਾਜ਼ੀ ਹੋਈ, ਸਾਨੂੰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ FIR ਦਰਜ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰਨ ਦਿੱਤੀ। 6 ਵਜੇ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਮੈਂ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਟੈਲੀਗ੍ਰਾਮਾਂ MLA ਇਲਾਕੇ ਦਾ ਸਰਦਾਰ ਬਚਿੱਤਰ ਸਿੰਘ, ਅਸੀਂ ਟੈਲੀਗ੍ਰਾਮਾਂ ਦਿੱਤੀਆਂ ਹਾਇਰ ਅਥਾਰਟੀਜ਼ ਨੂੰ। ਤਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਕੁਛ ਨਾ ਜਦ ਹੋਇਆ ਤਾਂ ਫਿਰ ਇੱਕ ਮਹੀਨੇ ਮਗਰੋਂ ਆਈ ਵੈਂਟ ਟੂ ਹਾਈ ਕੋਰਟ ਇਨ ਰਿਟ ਪਟੀਸ਼ਨ, ਹੈਬੀਅਸ ਕੋਰਟ ਰਿਟ ਪਟੀਸ਼ਨ ਵਿੱਚ ਹਾਈ ਕੋਰਟ ਗਏ। ਹਾਈ ਕੋਰਟ ਨੇ ਇਨਕੁਆਇਰੀ ਮਾਰ ਕਰਤੀ 18 ਜੂਨ 1990 ਨੂੰ ਚੀਫ ਜੁਡੀਸ਼ੀਅਲ ਮੈਜਿਸਟ੍ਰੇਟ ਰੋਪੜ ਇਨਕੁਆਇਰੀ ਅਫਸਰ ਲਾ ਦਿੱਤੇ। ਇਹ ਉੱਥੇ ਪੈਂਡਿੰਗ ਹੈ, ਪਰ ਮੈਂ ਸਮਝਦਾ ਵੀ ਮੈਂ ਦੇਸ਼ ਦੀਆਂ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਅਦਾਲਤਾਂ ਹੈ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਆਸ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ ਠੀਕ ਇਨਸਾਫ ਮਿਲਣ ਦੀ। ਬਾਕੀ ਵੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੀ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਫਿਰਦੀ ਹੈ, ਇਨਸਾਫ ਨਹੀਂ ਮਿਲਦਾ ਦਿਖਦਾ, ਪਰੰਤੂ ਕੋਰਟ 'ਤੇ ਨਿਰਭਰ ਕਰਦਾ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਕੀ ਡਿਸਾਈਡ ਕਰਦੀ ਹੈ ਕੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰਦੀ। ਪਰ ਮੈਂ ਐਕਸਪੈਕਟ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰਦਾ ਕਿ ਕੋਰਟ ਇਹ ਠੀਕ ਇਨਸਾਫ ਕਰੇਗੀ। ਉਹ ਅੰਮ੍ਰਿਤਧਾਰੀ ਗੁਰਸਿੱਖ ਸੀ, ਉਹ ਬਹੁਤ ਠੀਕ ਸੋਚ ਰੱਖਦਾ ਸੀ। ਪੁਲਿਸ ਦੀ ਮਾਰ ਕਟਾਈ ਕਰਕੇ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਅੰਡਰਗਰਾਊਂਡ ਹੋਣਾ ਪਿਆ। ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਮੁੰਡੇ ਪੁਲਿਸ ਨੇ ਮਾਰ ਕੇ ਸਿੱਟ ਦਿੱਤੇ, ਮੁੰਡੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਘਰੋਂ ਭੱਜ ਗਏ। ਪੁਲਿਸ ਨੇ ਜਾਣਬੁੱਝ ਕੇ ਭਜਾਏ, ਲੋਕ ਲੁੱਟੇ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਪੈਸੇ ਦੇ ਦਿੱਤੇ ਠੀਕ ਹੈ, ਨਹੀਂ ਦਿੱਤੇ ਮਾਰ ਕੇ ਨਹਿਰਾਂ 'ਚ ਸੁੱਟ ਦਿੱਤੇ।
So during this time, as these disappearances were happening more frequently, a human rights activist by the name of Jaswant Singh came on the scene. Now I'm going to spend just a couple minutes just talking a little bit about who he was, who Jaswant Singh is. He was born during the midst of the Punjabi Suba movement, who we've talked about. He grew up in very humble beginnings, humble upbringing. Both his father and grandfather were activists in both the Punjabi Suba movement as well as in the Indian independence movement. And he sort of inherited that same activist gene. He excelled in his academics considerably, but his passion was towards activism, whatever that type of activism might be. At the time when he was in college, whether it was pesticides that were being used in the farms, whether it was rate hikes that were used for certain entertainment venues for students, whether it was police abuse, he was what we would call today a serial activist. And even at an early age, he was arrested for his quote-unquote anti-government activities, but was released shortly thereafter. And as he grew older and had more responsibilities with his family, he became the village panchayat. And one of the main things, one of his personal issues that he wanted to address was police abuse. This was something that was very personal to him. And he challenged the police as the village panchayat to the point where the police would harass him. But this is something that he always dismissed because he knew that this was part of the job, part of what he subscribed to. So think about all the events that had happened. So, he grew up in this 1960s, 1970s time frame. We talk about the emergency, we talk about Indira Gandhi coming to power, the 1978 massacre. Around this time, in 1981, he gets married to his wife, Parojit Kaur, who was in full support of all his activism, and towards the later part of his life was really supporting the family as well. It wasn't until the rise of the militancy movement where he had lost his personal friend, Pyara Singh. And after he lost his friend, he decided, it really touched him, it really caught him, and he said, I want to go search for him. I want to find out where he is. So, as he was investigating to find the whereabouts of his friend Pyara Singh, he found that there were other families out there who were also looking for their loved ones. People who were looking for their sons, for their fathers, for their brothers, and they were nowhere to be found. Since there was a militancy movement going on, every month Punjab police would list out who were the different militants, or at least at a minimum, a count of the number of militants who were killed that month. The problem was the number of militants killed on this list was far less than the number of people who were missing. So that begged the question, where were they? Where are they disappeared? So, Jaswant Singh quit his job as a panchayat. He opened up the human rights wing of the Akali Dal. He gathered a bunch of reporters, human rights activists, attorneys, and he said, let's go research this. And all the while, this team of people were being harassed by the police, harassed by government officials, but they continued their work, at least however many of them could stick with it. And Jaswant Singh research led him to a cremation ground, Duryanamata. And that's where he finally found, after much research, he found that this is where his friend Pyara Singh was cremated. But then he noticed that under the listing there, it said that his body was unidentified and unclaimed. And as you can imagine, there's a certain procedure Punjab police must follow if a body is unclaimed or unidentified. From the way that they notify people, to the way it's reported, to the clothes that are kept for the family. You know, there's a certain procedure and process that you follow. None of these things were followed. So again came the question of how many other were unidentified and unclaimed. And they found hundreds. And then they noticed that in the registers, it said, let's say for example, in this week there was 30 bodies cremated in the register. But then looking at the register of how much wood was purchased, it was enough for 300 bodies. Again, these questions started coming up. And as they researched further for many years, just one thing came forward with the following information, that in just the Gurmat cremation ground in itself, 300 bodies were cremated as unidentified and unclaimed. 112 of those had their names recorded in the registry of birth and deaths, the rest were not. 41 out of those 300 had died of bullet injuries, but still unidentified and unclaimed. And post-mortem reports, which are required in every scenario, only done for 24 bodies. In the neighboring cremation ground, Party cremation ground, over 1991 to 1994, 538 bodies have been burned and have been marked as unidentified and unclaimed. Tarantara cremation ground, between 1991-92, 700 illegal cremations have taken place. After further research, the Gurmat cremation ground, within a 10-year period, 1984 to 1994, 2,000 illegal cremations have taken place. So, Jaswant Singh had decided to hold a press conference, which was highly publicized, where he announced his findings. That essentially, this top bullet, over 3,000 total cremations illegal cremations had taken place in 3 cremation grounds in simply one district of Punjab. The other 12, 13 have not even been touched. He discussed how the police had violated the procedures. It was also reported that the Rajasthan government was complaining that when they had cleared out the canals, that dead bodies were being piled up to the point where they were blocking the irrigation canals, of 6 with their hands and bodies tied being dumped into the canals. So he called upon the High Court that there are estimated 2,000 families in Amritsar district alone who are looking for their loved ones, and that the government, the CBI, the FBI equivalent, needs to do something about it. And again, as I mentioned, the findings were limited to this one area, and the CBI can take on looking at all of Punjab to see what's going on in terms of these illegal cremations. So, this was a highly controversial press conference, highly publicized conference, not only within Punjab, but throughout India. Immediately, the Director General of Police at the time, K.P. Gill, had offered a rebuttal. He said, these human rights folks, they're not doing anything about human rights. They are basically, knee-jerk reaction. They are ISI, Pakistani agents who are trying to revive militancy. And they just want to re-incite violence in Punjab. There's actually nothing wrong going on here. He went on to say that these people who have disappeared, these are just young people who are going overseas and have fake documents because they're going over illegally. So this was his rebuttal to the thousands of people who were illegally cremated. Jaswant Singh immediately replied the next day saying, well, everything that the DGP K.P. Gill has said is false, and I'm ready to go toe-to-toe in debate. You just let me know where and when. And so during this time, this is when Jaswant Singh had done further research, and he had come to the number that by taking what he has found, by looking at other districts, by other stories he has gathered, he is estimating that throughout Punjab there is likely a number between 20 and 25,000 legal cremations that have taken place. So with this information, and with the interest of the human rights community throughout the world, he went to the United States, he went to Canada, he went to England, and he spoke to anybody who would listen to him, so he could get some international attention for what was being said. In Canada, he spoke to Parliament, and he made this speech in April of '95 at Dixie Gurmat, and I want that we just started, we opened with a few minutes ago, and I just want to spend another few minutes where he speaks in his own words about what he saw in the cremation grounds.
ਉੱਥੇ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਪਿਆ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਕਿੰਨੀਆਂ ਲਾਸ਼ਾਂ ਕਿਹੜਾ ਪੁਲਿਸ ਅਫਸਰ ਦੇ ਕੇ ਗਿਆ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਵੀ ਅੱਗੇ ਗਏ ਤਾਂ ਉੱਥੇ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਪਿਆ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਕਿਹੜਾ ਥਾਣੇਦਾਰ ਕਿੰਨੀਆਂ ਲਾਸ਼ਾਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਇਆ। ਤੇ ਇਸ ਤੋਂ ਵੀ ਅੱਗੇ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਜਦੋਂ ਕੋਈ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਹੀ ਹੰਕਾਰ 'ਚ ਆ ਜਾਵੇ ਜਾਂ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਹਿ ਲੈਂਦੇ ਆ ਕਿ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਰੱਬ ਭੁੱਲ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਉਹ ਇਹੋ ਜਿਹੀਆਂ ਕਾਰਵਾਈਆਂ ਕਰਦਾ ਕਿ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਕਾਰਵਾਈਆਂ ਉਹਦੀ ਹਕੀਕਤ ਨੂੰ ਨੰਗਿਆਂ ਕਰ ਦੇਣਗੀਆਂ, ਜਾਂ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਦੇਸੀ ਢੰਗ ਨਾਲ ਆਪਾਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਕਿ ਚੋਰ ਨਿਸ਼ਾਨ ਛੱਡ ਜਾਂਦਾ। ਤਾਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਚੋਰਾਂ ਨੇ ਇੰਨੇ ਨਿਸ਼ਾਨ ਛੱਡ ਦਿੱਤੇ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਹੈਰਾਨ ਰਹਿ ਗਏ ਕਿ ਅੰਮ੍ਰਿਤਸਰ ਜ਼ਿਲ੍ਹੇ ਦੇ 3 ਸ਼ਹਿਰਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਮਿਊਨਿਸਪਲ ਕਮੇਟੀਆਂ ਦੇ ਸ਼ਮਸ਼ਾਨ ਘਾਟਾਂ 'ਚ 6017 ਲਾਸ਼ਾਂ ਅਜਿਹੀਆਂ ਸਨ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਸਾਫ਼ ਲਿਖੀਆਂ ਸਨ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਸਿੱਖ ਨੌਜਵਾਨਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਲਾਸ਼ਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਉਮਰ 15 ਤੋਂ 35 ਸਾਲ ਦੇ ਦਰਮਿਆਨ ਹੈ। ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ 'ਚ ਸਿਰਫ ਉਹ ਭਰਾਵਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ, ਉਹਦੇ 'ਚ ਲਿਖੀਆਂ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਬੀਬੀਆਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਲਾਸ਼ਾਂ ਵੀ ਨੇ। ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਹੈਰਾਨ ਹੋਏ ਕਿ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਇੱਥੇ ਬਜ਼ੁਰਗਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਲਾਸ਼ਾਂ ਵੀ ਨੇ, ਚਾਹੇ ਉਹ ਕੁਝ ਪਰਸੈਂਟ ਸੀ। ਤੇ ਇਹ ਵੀ ਉੱਥੇ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਉੱਥੇ ਸਾਡੀਆਂ ਮਾਤਾਵਾਂ ਦੀਆਂ ਲਾਸ਼ਾਂ ਵੀ ਨੇ। ਉੱਥੇ ਮਾਤਾ ਗਰਮੇਜ ਕੌਰ ਜਿਹਨੇ ਬਾਬਾ ਮਾਣੋਚਾਲ ਜੰਮਿਆ ਸੀ ਉਹਦੀ ਲਾਸ਼ ਵੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਲੱਭੀ। ਉੱਥੇ ਬੀਬੀ ਮਹਿੰਦਰ ਕੌਰ ਜਿਹਨੇ ਪਰਮਜੀਤ ਸਿੰਘ ਪੰਜਵੜ ਜੰਮਿਆ ਉਹਦੀ ਲਾਸ਼ ਵੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਲੱਭੀ। ਤੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਹਰਮਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਸੁਲਤਾਨਵਿੰਡ ਦੇ ਚਾਚੇ ਬਾਬਾ ਪਿਆਰਾ ਸਿੰਘ ਦੀ ਲਾਸ਼ ਵੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਲੱਭੀ। ਤੇ ਭਰਾਓ, ਜਦੋਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਸਾਰੀ ਹਕੀਕਤ ਮਿਲੀ ਤਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਸ ਦੇਸ਼ ਦੀ ਉੱਚ ਅਦਾਲਤ 'ਚ ਗਏ। ਅਸੀਂ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਤੇ ਹਰਿਆਣਾ ਹਾਈ ਕੋਰਟ ਦਾ ਦਰਵਾਜ਼ਾ ਖੜਕਾਇਆ ਕਿ ਜਰਵਾਣਿਓ ਘੱਟੋ ਘੱਟ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਡਿਟੇਲ ਤਾਂ ਦੇ ਦਿਓ ਕਿ ਕਿਹੜੀ ਲਾਸ਼ ਕਿਹਦੀ ਹੈ, ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਹਰੇਕ ਮਾਂ ਭੈਣ ਨੂੰ ਦੱਸ ਸਕੀਏ, ਹਰੇਕ ਬਾਪ ਨੂੰ ਦੱਸ ਸਕੀਏ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਆਪਣੇ ਦਿਲ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜੋ ਧਾਰੀ ਅਰਦਾਸ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਸਤਿਗੁਰਾਂ ਪਾਸ ਕਰ ਸਕੇ ਕਿ ਸਤਿਗੁਰੂ ਮੇਰੇ ਪੁੱਤ ਨੂੰ ਆਪਣੇ ਚਰਨਾਂ 'ਚ ਨਿਵਾਸ ਬਖਸ਼ੀਏ। ਆਪਣੀ ਰਵਾਇਤ ਹੈ, ਅਸੀਂ ਪੁੱਤ ਮੰਗਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਸਤਿਗੁਰੂ ਪਾਸ ਅਰਦਾਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਘਰ ਦੇ ਜੀਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਤੋਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਸਤਿਗੁਰ ਪਾਸ ਅਰਦਾਸ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਚਰਨਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਲਾ ਲੈ। ਤਾਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਜਦ ਇਹ ਮੰਗ ਕੀਤੀ ਕਿ ਕੁਛ ਨਹੀਂ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਘੱਟੋ ਘੱਟ ਇਹ ਦੱਸ ਦਿਓ ਕਿ ਕਿਹੜੇ ਘਰ ਦਾ ਹੀਰਾ ਕਿਹੜੀ ਸ਼ਮਸ਼ਾਨ ਘਾਟ 'ਚ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਦੋਂ ਸਾੜਿਆ ਸੀ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਕਾਨੂੰਨ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਲਾਵਾਰਸ ਲਾਸ਼ ਦੀਆਂ ਫੋਟੋਆਂ ਰੱਖੀਆਂ ਜਾਂਦੀਆਂ। ਕਾਨੂੰਨ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਲਾਵਾਰਸ ਲਾਸ਼ ਦੇ ਕੱਪੜੇ ਉਦੋਂ ਤੱਕ ਸਾਂਭ ਕੇ ਰੱਖੇ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਆ ਜਦ ਤੱਕ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਵਾਰਸ ਕਲੇਮ ਨਾ ਕਰੇ। ਪਰ ਉਹ ਦੇਸ਼ ਜੋ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਡੀ ਜਮਹੂਰੀਅਤ ਤੇ ਨਿਆਂ ਪਸੰਦ ਕਹਾਉਂਦਾ ਹੈ, ਉਸ ਦੇ ਹਾਈ ਕੋਰਟ ਨੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਇੰਜ ਕਰੋ, ਇਹ ਪਬਲਿਕ ਇੰਟਰਸਟ ਲਿਟੀਗੇਸ਼ਨ ਤਾਂ ਬਣਦੀ ਨਹੀਂ, ਇਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡਾ ਮਸਲਾ ਖੜਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈ। ਤੁਸੀਂ ਹਰੇਕ ਪਰਿਵਾਰ ਨੂੰ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਲਾਸ਼ ਹੈ ਭੇਜ ਦਿਓ, ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਦੇਵਾਂਗੇ। ਕਾਨੂੰਨ ਨਾਲ ਮਖੌਲ ਕੀਤਾ ਗਿਆ ਹੈ, ਇੱਕ ਕੌਮ ਨਾਲ ਮਖੌਲ ਕੀਤਾ ਗਿਆ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਮਖੌਲ ਕੀਤਾ ਗਿਆ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਹੋਰ ਕੁਝ ਨਹੀਂ ਮੰਗਦੇ, ਸਿਰਫ ਡੈਥ ਸਰਟੀਫਿਕੇਟ ਹੀ ਮੰਗਦੇ ਸੀ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਹਾਈ ਕੋਰਟ ਤੋਂ ਮੰਗਿਆ।
So again, talking about myths and truths, here Jaswant Singh is being made out to be someone who is inciting violence, and as you can see here, what he's really looking for is death certificates for the families. So when Jaswant Singh had returned from his travel overseas, again this number of 25,000 and the international attention gained a lot of attention. to the point where Jaswant Singh was receiving a lot of threatening phone calls at his home, both to himself as well as his family. He also has a friend who was part of the Congress Party, an MLA, who said to him that he's been part of conversations, and he heard Jaswant Singh's name coming up and saying that if we made thousands die, we made thousands disappear, we can easily make one more disappear too. The CBI, the Punjab police, were showing up at his house every day, hanging around his house in plain clothes, asking him what he's doing, where he's going, what his plans were. But again, Jaswant Singh knew that this was part of the territory, and he dismissed all of those and continued on with his work. He then came up with in the second press conference, where not only did he release the number of 25,000, but he also directly responded to the claims and just directly responded to the threats that he was getting. He said, the Punjab government is highly mistaken in thinking that by eliminating me, the matter related to 25,000 unclaimed bodies in Punjab can be put to an end. And listen to this. If something were to happen to me, hold the police chief, KPS Gill, and Chief Minister Byan Singh responsible. So, again, many tense exchanges that happened over those next few days. Many of Jaswant Singh's friends and family came together and said, you know what, this might be a time where you need to take a break and leave Amritsar for a little while. He said he may consider it at one point, but for now he's going to continue doing the work that he's doing. During this time, right around this time, the Chief Minister of Punjab, Byan Singh, was assassinated. This is when things got a little bit anxious, simply because during that time of the assassination of Byan Singh, Singhs were being picked up all throughout Punjab. And Jaswant Singh knew that this could very easily be a situation where he could be brought in or where he could be abducted because of the chaos that's happening at this time. So he decided to take a different route. He said, you know, if this is going to happen to me, then let's do it in the daylight. So he went to the local police station. He turned himself in. He said, I've done nothing wrong. I have not broken any laws. But I know you're after me. And if you're going to arrest me now. Let it be with people present. Let it be in daylight, because I don't want it to happen the other way. The police station sent him home. They said, we have nothing on you. You go home. 3 days later, on August 5th, 1995, while he is in his own home having an interview with a journalist at Rubin, armed commandos stormed into Jaswant Singh Kalra's home and abducted him. What happened next is, there's a very detailed timeline that we don't have time to go through today. I encourage you to read through the history. But months later, a prisoner by the name of Gurmat Singh, who was in jail for a completely different reason, did, in the court of law, give his own testimony of what he saw. That 3 days later, after this abduction, on August 8, 1995, Jaswant Singh Kalra entered his cell. They shared a cell together. He said that Jaswant Singh was so badly tortured, so badly beaten, that he couldn't even eat the food that was given to him. And Gurmat Singh said that he helped feed him during that short time while he was in prison with him. And immediately after, he was taken away again. Again, what happened after that would not be found out till 3-4 years later. Jaswant Singh Kalra was disappeared. It wasn't until actually the person who was responsible for his detainment was SSP Ajit Singh Sandhu. And he ultimately committed suicide and was never brought to any trial. But the officer, Rubin, who was responsible for guarding the place where Jaswant Singh was staying, he was the one by the door guarding it. It wasn't until 3-4 years later where he gave his testimony of what actually happened to Jaswant Singh. After several days of torture, he was interrogated further. KP Gill interrogated him. And a few days later, several senior police officers of Punjab Police interrogated him. And on that day, while he was guarding the room, they asked this officer, bodyguard, Rubin Singh, to go get some water. And while he went in the other room, 2 shots were fired. He would then later say in his testimony that that day they took a body out of that room, covered up a bleeding body, they escorted him into a jeep, and his body was later on thrown in the river that night, into the Harikar Canal. And this testimony, like I said, wouldn't come to 3-4 years later. So again, there's a lot of history in timeline I could go through about what were the events that happened as part of the trial. There were several witnesses involved. Paramjit Kaur was there. She immediately after the abduction had sent letters to the Punjab police, had sent letters to KP Gill, had sent telegrams, had gone there face to face, had sent letters to the Galpak, had sent letters to the SGPC for anyone to help find out where was her husband. She was one of the witnesses in the case. Rajiv Randhawa, the journalist, was a witness in the case. Kishore Singh was a witness. Eventually, Kuldeep Singh was a witness. And all of these witnesses were harassed and had their lives threatened during the Jaswant Singh Kalra trial. Even to the point where Kishore Singh was threatened of having his case extended and his jail time sentence extended to a point where he withdrew his testimony and became hostile. But throughout in my opinion, the hard work and the effort of Paramjit Kaur and her legal team, after 10 years, in 2005, 5 low-level, middle-level officers were indicted for the murder of Jaswant Singh Kalra. Now, call it indictment if you want, but a few months later, some of these cops were found out and about on the streets. And maybe this is just the way the prison system works in India, but then they give them breaks or something. But it wasn't until 2011, just 2 years ago, after the police officers appealed, where the case was finally upheld, and they would be in life in prison, these 5 officers. Now, although the legal team and Paramjit Kaur welcomed this decision, they also felt that although these 5 officers committed these horrible crimes, the person who is ultimately responsible needs to be held accountable as well. And that's the chief, the then DGP, KP Gill. He is the person that needs to be held accountable. He's the person that ordered all these things, and he is the one who needs to stand trial. Kind of rounding out the life of Jaswant Singh Kalra, I really wanted to share a quote that his father had made, after his death was announced and after his at this sort of Shahidi program, and he said the following things. And I know it's kind of long, but I just want everybody to hear it because I think it nicely encapsulates Jaswant Singh's life. He said, "My son followed the path of truth and bold opposition to injustice. He was proud of his ancestral history and martyrdom for justice and freedom. And in spite of my personal grief at his loss, I know that if there is to be hope for Punjab and for India, there has to be a resurgence of that spirit of freedom and the courage of conviction which my son embodied." Let me repeat that. If there is to be hope for Punjab and for India, there has to be a resurgence of that spirit of freedom and the courage of conviction which my son embodied. I have faith. In spite of the sad state of affairs today, there will be a new phase of strength to realize the ideals of freedom which our leaders have betrayed. I hope Jaswant Singh's sacrifice will contribute to initiating that process. Now, for me personally, I'll tell you that Jaswant Singh Kalra is one of my personal heroes. Jaswant Singh, as well as some of the others spoken about today, are something that are deep inspirations to me, to my family. We keep pictures in our children's room and tell the story of people like Jaswant Singh Kalra. Another one of my personal heroes is his wife, Paramjit Kaur. Because there are many opportunities where someone in her situation could have just given up and thrown up her hands and said, the system is not going to work for me. But through 10 years of tireless effort, she took whatever justice that she could get and completely through her effort. There were plenty of times, in the way that the court systems work in India, if you fail to cross one T or dot one I, or forget to check one box, or forget to show up in one particular hearing, the whole case is thrown out. And for her to get from different parts of Punjab and to get to Delhi for the appropriate things and to speak out when her life is being threatened is something pretty impressive. It's something that we should all remember and do it lots for her. And I don't know if any of you have met their daughter, Navkiran Kaur, who I had a chance to meet. Sanjay and I had a chance to speak on a panel with her. And she's not only a few years older than most of you here. And I'll say that I can safely say that she has inherited that same gene of activism and passion for the moment. Another thought I wanted to share was, I remember in 1998, so I was sort of wrapping up college at this point, where I was a member of Amnesty International. How many of you are part of like an Amnesty International chapter in your school or work. Ouch. All right. So it was a club, a human rights club, where we would gather together a group of people and we would write letters on whatever the urgent action was for the week. And we would send letters to that government saying, hey, we have international concern with this individual. We would have even a form letter, put a letter together and send it. And I'll never forget, after years and years of pulling out letters of somebody from Iran, somebody from China, somebody from Africa, and this is what I pulled out one day in April of 1998. And I remember being in that room full of other activists, and they were, Black, Latino, Asians, all of us were in this room, and they were all, and I spoke about his case for a little bit, and they were just appalled. They couldn't believe that this is something that happened in the world, that this could happen. And nobody, the international community, wasn't doing enough to find out where he was. That a human rights activist who had not broken any laws could be treated this way. And we all wrote letters to the middle of the night, getting anyone who we could passing by our office on campus to sign on the petitions and write letters. And I remember that Sunday going to the Gurmat and asking the chairman of the Gurmat if I could make a short speech and we could get some more petitions and signatures. And forget public interest litigation. It wasn't even in public interest of the Gurmat. Their first question was just one, who? And why do we want to spend our time doing this? Things are peaceful in Punjab. Let's leave these issues alone. So that was the environment at the time. That we have human rights activists who are working for things like Jaswant Singh, but our own people didn't want anything to do with it. So I can go on and on. Again, I want to leave as much time as possible for some questions and another short clip or two. I know I'm focusing on specifically Jaswant Singh here because I think his story and his personality shows a little bit about the narrative. But let's not forget the thousands and thousands of other families that had similar problems and who are still waiting for the rest. Now, I told you about the murder trial, but as a result of this, the High Court in India said, okay, we'll put a commission together to research these cremations that you're talking about. So they put together the National Human Rights Commission. And they created a mandate and said this commission will investigate these cremation grounds. So all these families came together and said, no, you're not going to just focus on these three, you're going to focus on all of Punjab. You'll never get the complete picture unless you focus on all the districts. And they said, no, we're not, this is what our mandate is. 7 years pass where they're debating this issue with the NHRC. Finally, they said, well, you know what? We're not going to worry about what the mandate is. Give me a list of names of the families, we'll give you compensation. If it was a brother, we'll give you whatever, how many thousand rupees. If it was your father, major breadwinner, we'll give you X amount. They put a formula together and said, this is what we'll offer you. And although most of the families came from very humble homes, they unanimously rejected this arbitrary compensation. So they said, we don't want your money, we want justice. And to this day, the lawsuits individually are going on. The NHRC resolved, nothing came of it. And as we'll see, I believe tomorrow, I think, we're going to take a look at Insaf's most recent documentary that's going to speak a little bit more about the families who are waiting for justice. So what Insaf, like you mentioned, this organization, if you're not familiar with them, they are an organization that focuses purely on the human rights violations and advocating for survivors of the human rights violations in Punjab. And what they're asking for is three things: truth, justice, and reparations. Then let the truth be known. Workshops like this, documentation like that, interviews like you're seeing, the documentary that we're going to watch tomorrow, let the truth be known. And let the government investigate what's going on, whether it's through the CBI, whether it's through the NHRC, and let the truth be known to the world. Secondly, hold the people accountable. The KP Guilds, all the senior officers, all the people who were responsible for this need to be held accountable in court of law. And this is the part, the justice part is one thing that just troubles me, because all this stuff that we're talking about, 1984, 1995, to this day, there's not one thing legally that has changed that would prevent any of this from happening again. Not one thing has changed. Not one law has passed, not one policy has changed. Nothing has changed from a 1984, from a 1995, from any of this happening again. So we're going to talk about history and repeating itself and all that kind of stuff in tomorrow's workshop. But the justice part is the part that we're lacking the most. And then reparations, at a minimum, financially, economically, after these first two things have been done, bring the families whole who have lost their loved ones due to the actions of the government. So I'm going to close out with just one more short clip with a 2-minute clip from another parent who lost their child. And again, I think he encapsulates it well and sums up exactly the emotion that I'm trying to convey in this, and one thing that I hope that you capture from this. And then we will open it up to questions. And this is Menderson.
ਮੇਰੇ ਕੋਲ 9:30 ਵਜੇ ਆਇਆ ਜੀ। ਉਹਨੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਆ ਕੇ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਵੀ ਆ ਸਟਾਰਟਿੰਗ ਟਰਬਲ ਹੈ ਗੱਡੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਔਰ ਮੈਂ ਕਿਹਾ ਠੀਕ ਹੋਣੀ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ ਹੈ। ਚਲਾ ਗਿਆ ਮਗਰ ਹੀ ਉੱਥੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਪੁਲਿਸ ਵਾਲਿਆਂ ਦੀ PCO 42 ਗੱਡੀ ਦਾ ਨੰਬਰ ਸੀ, ਨੀਲੇ ਰੰਗ ਦੀ। ਉਹ ਮਗਰ ਲਾ ਰਹੀ ਸੀ। ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪੁਲਿਸ ਵਾਲੇ ਬੈਠੇ ਸੀ ਵਿਦਆਊਟ ਯੂਨੀਫਾਰਮ, ਸਿੰਪਲ ਕੱਪੜੇ ਸੀਗੇ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਜਦੋਂ ਰੁਕਿਆ ਉੱਥੋਂ ਕਿਡਨੈਪ ਕਰਕੇ ਸਿੱਧਾ ਹੀ ਮਰੂਤੀ ਵੈਨ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸੀ ਉਹਦੀ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਸਿੱਧਾ ਹੀ ਲੈ ਗਏ ਉਹ 8 ਫੇਸ ਥਾਣੇ। ਉੱਥੇ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਟਾਰਚਰ ਕੀਤਾ। ਉਹ 16 ਨੂੰ ਸੋਮਵਾਰ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਪੇਪਰ ਰਾਹੀਂ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗਿਆ, 3 ਪੇਪਰਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆ ਗਿਆ ਸੀ ਇਹਦਾ ਸਾਰਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਇਨਕਾਊਂਟਰ ਕੀਤਾ। ਫਿਰ ਇੱਦਾਂ ਇਨਕਾਊਂਟਰ ਵਿੱਚ 2 ਬੰਦੇ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ ਇਹ ਮਾਰੇ ਗਏ। ਨਹੀਂ ਤਾਂ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਜੇ ਪੇਪਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਨਾਮ ਨਹੀਂ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਵੀ ਉਹ 'ਚ ਲਿਖਿਆ ਸੀ ਵਾਈਟ ਮਰੂਤੀ ਵੈਨ ਵਿਦਆਊਟ ਨੰਬਰ, ਹਾਲਾਂਕਿ ਉਹਦਾ ਨੰਬਰ ਸੀ CH01 1967 ਨੰਬਰ ਸੀ। ਉਹ ਨੇਮ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਹੈ ਰਜਿਸਟਰਡ ਨੰਬਰ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਹੈਗੇ ਲਾ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਪੁਲਿਸ ਵਾਲਿਆਂ ਦਾ, ਉਹਨੂੰ ਵਿਦਆਊਟ ਨੰਬਰ ਦੱਸ ਦਿੱਤਾ। ਪੋਲੀਟੀਕਲ ਲੈਵਲ ਤੇ ਪੁਲਿਸ ਲੈਵਲ ਤੇ ਸਾਰੀ ਮੈਂ ਨਸਬਾਜ਼ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੈ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਸਾਰੇ ਪਾਸੇ ਮੇਰੀ ਵਾਪਸੀ ਸੀ। ਸਭ ਨਾਲ ਮੈਂ ਮਿਲਿਆ। ਉਹਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਉੱਥੋਂ ਅੰਮ੍ਰਿਤਸਰ ਮਿਲਿਆ, ਬਹੁਤ ਬੰਦਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਿਆ, ਜਿਵੇਂ ਕੋਈ ਸਾਰੀ ਲਿਸਟ ਹੈਗੀ ਬਣਾਈ ਹੋਈ। ਲੇਕਿਨ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਜੁਡੀਸ਼ਰੀ ਹੈ ਉਹਨੇ ਕੋਈ ਇਨਸਾਫ ਨਹੀਂ ਦਿੱਤਾ। ਖਤਮ ਹੋ ਗਈ ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨ ਦੀ ਜੁਡੀਸ਼ਰੀ। ਥੋੜ੍ਹਾ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਜੀ 10 ਸਾਲ, ਜਦੋਂ ਸਾਰੇ ਪ੍ਰੂਫ 2 ਸਾਲਾਂ ਦੇ ਸਾਰਾ ਖਤਮ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ ਸੀਗਾ। CBI ਵਾਲਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਮੈਕਸੀਮਮ ਡਿਲੇ ਕੀਤੀ। CBI ਦੇ ਡਾਇਰੈਕਟਰ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਪਰਸਨਲੀ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਮਿਲ ਕੇ ਆਇਆ ਦਿੱਲੀ, ਔਰ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਕੰਪਲੇਂਟ ਆਪਣੀ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ। ਕੋਈ ਜਵਾਬ ਨਹੀਂ CBI ਦੇ ਡਾਇਰੈਕਟਰ ਨੇ, ਡਾਇਰੈਕਟੋਰੇਟ ਦਿੱਲੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ। ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ 3 ਮੈਂ ਰਿਮਾਈਂਡਰ ਭੇਜੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ, ਕੋਈ ਜਵਾਬ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਗਿਆ ਹੈਗਾ। ਇਹ ਹਾਲਤ ਹੈ ਹਿੰਦੁਸਤਾਨ ਦੀ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਕਹਿਤਾ ਜੋ ਪੁਲਿਸ ਵਾਲੇ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਠੀਕ ਹੈ, ਜਿਹੜਾ ਪਟੀਸ਼ਨਰ ਹੈਗਾ ਇਹ ਗਲਤ ਹੈ। ਆਈ ਵਿਟਨੈਸ ਜਿਹਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਵੀ ਮੇਰੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਚੱਕਿਆ ਹੈ ਜਗਰਾਜ ਨੂੰ, ਉਹ ਵੀ ਝੂਠਾ, ਮੈਂ ਵੀ ਝੂਠਾ। ਮੇਰੇ ਸਾਰੇ 11 ਗਵਾਹ ਸੀਗੇ, ਸਭ ਝੂਠੇ। ਪੁਲਿਸ ਵਾਲੇ ਸੱਚੇ। ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਮਾਰਿਆ ਇੱਕ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਾਤਲ ਹੈਗੇ ਉਹ ਸੱਚੇ ਹੈ। ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇੱਕ ਸਫਰ ਹੈ, ਵਿਕਟਮ ਹੈ, ਮਜ਼ਲੂਮ ਹੈ, ਜਿਹਦੇ ਤੇ ਜ਼ੁਲਮ ਇੰਨਾ ਹੋਇਆ ਹੈਗਾ ਉਹ ਝੂਠਾ। ਕੀ ਇਨਸਾਫ ਇਹ ਤੋਂ ਮਿਲ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈਗਾ?
So I want to, before I open up for questions, I just want to ask for my own education. For how many of you here was this new information? Okay, that's good. That's good. That's less than I normally see, so that's good. Thoughts? What are your thoughts?